Okay, well, we were talking about just before this podcast that we might dive into the deeper into Christian Zionism. So,
Right.
I think that this is a fascinating topic for me. I still my knowledge is still very superficial. So maybe we can just start with maybe just telling us just what is Christian Zionism, because if there's any new listeners out there, just to even understand the basic concept of
Right.
it, and then we'll just see what
Okay.
happens.
Yeah. I think it was maybe a couple months ago. We discussed it briefly, and I just sketched it out. And yeah, the sketch was correct, but there's a lot of gaps that I think we need to fill in. And after I gave that presentation, I realized I needed to do further research. And one thing I did was to read this book here.
On the Road to Armageddon by
Yeah,
Timothy who?
Weber. There
Timothy
we go.
Weber. Okay.
Yeah. No, I think it's a very good book. It very well researched, and it really actually it did change my understanding of it in some important ways. And I'll say, the most important thing is that I realized that Christian Zionism is a phenomenon independent, to a great degree of Jewish Zionism. In this day and age, you see, I think in the present time, it's fair to say that Jewish Zionism is dominant. That's the more powerful force at the present time, and it tends to guide and shape Christian Zionism, but not entirely. The thing is that it's not been that way, and it has. What it's clear is that it has an independent existence. It's something that arose on its own terms, without any Jewish influence whatsoever. So, just to sketch it out very briefly, it's something that arose in Great Britain in the 1830s. In particular, there was one ex-Anglican priest, Irish priest, who named Darby, John Nelson Darby. And he was the one who came up with this, I guess, kind of the basic framework of Christian Zionism. It's actually known by the name of dispensational, dispensationalism. I'm sorry, dispensationalism. And a dispensation actually refers to, it's just like a phase in the relationship between God and man. So this whole notion of like dispensations is not really entirely is alien to traditional Christian thinking. Like earlier we mentioned, there was the Old Covenant that goes with the Old Testament, and the New Covenant that goes with the New Testament. It's a new relationship between God and man. Um, so anyway, he went through and he kind of mapped out these phases and called them dispensations, and therefore we get the name of dispensationalism. But that's not really the core of Christian. That's not what makes it Christian Zionist. It's the there was a kind of little twist to his thinking, to Darby's thinking, and that is that he saw that this relationship between God and man had become separated, like between the Jews and the Gentiles, and not, we're not talking about before the arrival of Christ, but after it. So that, again, the traditional understanding is basically that special relationship with the Jews ended with the arrival of the Messiah, Christ. And then there's a relationship between God and all believers, regardless of whether they're Jews or Gentiles. But the way he looked at it is that, okay, that special relationship remained. And therefore, there are various prophecies in the Bible that are understood, again, by traditional Christians as referring to to Christians and their relationship to God. But these are just specifically for the Jews. So, like, there's sort of um, two streams of time going forward at this simultaneously. One is for the Gentiles, and the other is for the Jews. Now, he calls this like this time following um, the arrival of the Messiah. After the life of Christ, the life and death of Christ on this earth. He says this is that inaugurated the age of the Gentiles. But that Jewish relationship never actually ended. And so that like God has a special plan for the Jews. And what he saw was like the age of the Gentiles as almost being some sort of aberration. And actually the Gentiles, the believing Gentiles, the Christians, have to be gotten out of the way for God's plan for the Jews to finally reach fruition and bring us to the kind of the end of the world. So that's where the idea of the rapture comes from, right? That believing Christians are just going to be kind of teleported up to heaven at some point in the future. Then they'll all disappear. They'll vanish from the face of the earth. And at that point, the age of the Gentiles will end, and we'll have, the beginning of this then this great drama of the end times will take place. Or that's part of the great drama, the end times. Okay, well, you made specific, predictions about what would happen, and one of them, probably the most important thing, was that the Jews would come into the land, would return to the land of Israel. That's what it's called, the restoration, and reestablish, the kingdom of Israel with Jerusalem as its capital. Now, again, he's saying this back in 1830, which just seemed like a really far-fetched notion. And it was something they're just on the fringes, again, just in like the British Isles, found among some churches, not the Anglican Church, but some these reformist churches in England and Ireland. But eventually it made its way to the United States around the 1870s, and it began to spread, again, not within the mainstream churches, but among, I guess, what, people we called fundamentalists or evangelicals at this time. Now, the important thing is to remember back then, like in the 19th century and through most of the 20th century, the vast majority of Christians were Catholics or Lutherans or, Anglicans or Methodists. They were part of what, you would call a mainline denomination. And this thinking really had very little impact on those mainline denominations. So it was this minority of fundamentalists where it was among them that it began to spread. And well, so this vision of the end times that started with Darby was further developed, in the U.S. And I guess I'll just sketch it out very briefly. It's okay. The Jews return to Israel, and then the Roman Empire is reconstituted, and it's ruled over by the Antichrist. But nobody knows that he is the Antichrist at that time because he appears to be a man of peace. And well, the Jews, after they move in, they suffer tribulations and so forth. And actually, the Antichrist poses as their protector and does indeed protect them at that time. Then, there's Israel is threatened by what they call the Alliance of the North, and they say that this is the biblical nation of Gog. Is something that, there's a reference to a Gog and I guess is the book of Ezekiel, and then again in the book of Revelations, and these dispensationalists, they worked out that this Gog must be Russia. So Russia will attack from the north, and then there will be the kingdoms of the south will attack from the south, but then God will intervene and supernaturally destroy these armies, and then there will be this time of peace where Israel will then be able to reinstitute. Well, I guess it actually begins before, under the protection of the Antichrist. They begin to practice sacrifices like they did in the old Israel, and they rebuild the third temple. And then, of course, they're threatened by these great armies, but these are supernaturally destroyed. And then there's an army that's supposed to come from the east, and the Antichrist will defeat it. It'll be a horrible battle, like the third of the population of the world will die. And then it's after that the Antichrist will show his true colors and will actually demand that the world start to worship him. He'll go into that temple that's been rebuilt in Jerusalem, and he'll no longer pretend to be a protector of the Jews, but he will be, proclaim himself their God and say they must worship him directly. And then this will be a time of great tribulations, and a certain number of Jews will realize, oh, that we need the Messiah. And, they'll suffer greatly, but the Messiah will come. That'll be Jesus, but he'll establish an earthly kingdom that'll last for 1,000 years, and with Jerusalem as his capital. So this is actually, more or less, things kind of changed over time, but that's the basic vision of the end times that these people have. And it's been laid out. There's some bestsellers. I mean, this has had a real influence on American culture, and, a lot of other churches, Protestant churches or evangelical churches around the world. Back in 1970, there was a book called The Late Great Planet Earth it sold hundreds and hundreds of thousands of copies, millions of copies, and been translated into dozens of languages. And it pretty much laid this out. And then more recently, we had the Left Behind series. And that was
I remember that.
Yeah.
I was in middle school when it came out, and it was huge. Everybody was talking about it. Everybody was talking about the rapture in middle school and high school.
Right. Yeah, so these are, right, I was sort of barely aware of it, okay, well, this is fiction, but it turns out there are a lot of people that take this very, very seriously. And it's had a real influence on politics, on geopolitics, because, these people, well, part of it, there's sort of a tension, say, okay, this is just what's going to happen. This is God's plan and we can't stop it. But then there's this temptation to help things along. And you find this going all the way back to the 19th century. There was a guy named Blackstone around 1890 who began actually pushing for a Jewish nation in Israel. Again, this seemed kind of nutty back then because it was under the Ottoman Empire that wasn't going to let this happen. But he got, he had a petition. He ended up having, U.S. senators, Supreme Court justices, journalists from the leading newspapers of the time, all kinds of, luminaries signed it, and he presented it to President Benjamin Harrison back then. So, and this was before there was the Jewish Zionism had actually begun. Theodor Herzl was just starting to talk about it, but it hadn't.
So Christian Zionism predates Jewish Zionism?
Yeah, that's the thing that I found fascinating. Not by much, but it does. And he actually talks to this Blackstone. It wasn't these days, there are a lot of organizations of Christians and Jews, and more often than not, they're organized by Jews who see these Christians as useful idiots. I don't think that's always true, but sometimes it clearly is. But he was the first one to organize one of these conferences, conferences for Christians and Jews. And he got up there, I guess it was in Chicago in 1891 or something like that. And, said, okay, we've got to have, you Jews need to go back to Israel and reestablish the old kingdom, and with Jerusalem as your capital. And the great majority of Jews were saying, what's this guy's talking about? But but it was not too longer that 1897 that Theodor Herzl held the first Zionist World Conference. So it predates it, but not by a whole lot. I guess you have to say, going back to Darby, that was way back in the 1830s.
So we can see that's the origin then, is John Darby, 1830s.
Right.
He planted that seed. Do you think that, the Jewish concept of Zionism would have ever been established if it wasn't for somebody like John Darby that just created this?
Yeah, I think so. I think they actually have their different phenomena, at least, in their starting points and their origins. And yeah, they originated independently. I mean, you have to say there's a certain amount of, of mutual influence, but initially I think they're really very, very independent phenomena. Theodor Herzl, for example, was entirely secular, and the first Jewish Zionists were almost entirely secular. They had no interest in some sort of end times vision or anything. They just wanted to establish a place for a nation for themselves. They felt like, we're Europeans and all the other Europeans have their own nation. We don't, and we're going to establish this in Israel. Well, it wasn't necessarily even Israel. In 1903, I think that was at maybe the Second Zionist Congress, he proposed Uganda my birthplace as a homeland for the Jews. And boy, the world would be a different place if that's where, I don't know if it would be a whole lot better, but it might, but it would be a different place with different different conflicts if it had been Uganda. So he wasn't actually fixated on having it in Palestine.